Well, February the 6th here, but this one may be a little more timeless though than some of the ones I do. There will be some very topical comments, but I think some of them are more general. One of the big things that kind of I got on my mind today is this Time magazine article, "The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election," which actually confirms a lot of the if you want to call them quote conspiracy unquote theories that President Trump and his supporters have had about what happened in this election, which is kind of interesting. I mean, the theory is if something's a conspiracy, it didn't happen, but actually conspiracies do happen, and apparently these people have decided to brag about their work, which I think vindicates my own opinion, and I think it shows where that our good Donald Trump may have jumped the shark a little bit. If he'd waited a little bit, he'd actually be in a lot better case to make his things. I thought for sure they were going to eventually brag about it. So anyway, if you like these videos, please subscribe and ring the bell if you want to get notified if that's an issue. Forward them to people who are interested, and give me a like, and comments are always appreciated. Now let's get back to this article, which is very interesting because it really says there's a guy named Mike Podhorzer, I think is how you pronounce it, who was a senior advisor to the labor union AFL-CIO, the big one, right? And he became concerned about the election in late 2019 and started working to make sure the election came off good. Of course, the thing is written. Remember, the people running it are totally in the liberal movement. They're totally agreeing with everything the liberals do, right? And of course they kind of paint over anything negative for them as like, it didn't really happen. Like sometimes the racial justice protests were a little bit too destructive, or just, there's nothing to see here, right? Mostly peaceful protests. They burned down the city of Minneapolis, that kind of thing. So you get that idea in it, but it basically details how it was done. It's for any conservative that wants to be informed, it's a worthy read. I'll try to put a link to it below so that you can read it yourself and see if you agree with my theories on it. But basically it details how that they and some lawyers and activist groups and all coordinated along with some renegade Republicans to make sure that horrible person, President Donald Trump, who had these dictatorial intentions, couldn't steal the election and all this stuff. And remember, this is before anything. This is really early on. And in fact, it does describe how that they worked along with getting some government money and then a lot of money from people such as a foundation created by Zuckerberg of YouTube fame to raise more money to actually fund a variety of things which help facilitate the paper mail-in balloting and the voter turnout efforts and so forth. I mean, it pretty well describes how they got election laws changed with court rulings and so forth in order to achieve their goal there, and so forth. So it's a very interesting read. I mean, you have to be careful when you read these things not to totally believe. You have to understand that you're dealing with a very biased writer here in the way they spin everything their own way. I mean, the whole part that somehow that Trump was very dictatorial seems to me to be really, compared to what we have now in Biden, that's absurd. I mean, Biden is trying to rule by decree by comparison to what Trump did. And remember that Trump always obeyed all court orders during all this stuff, if you'll recall, and was continually harassed by a lot of really invalid court orders by activist judges in various district courts. So anyhow, I think it's a very interesting read, and kind of shows, what was going on and how that they were basically, trying to pressure various people into various things, and also how the Chamber of Commerce in the end basically came on board with their efforts as well. So it's kind of like everything your right-wing talk show host was claiming all along was actually more true than they were claiming it in some ways. One wonders what the motivation of the Chamber of Commerce was, although it may well be that the general reaction, I think, of the business community to things like riots and instability, and I've seen this back to when I was, a kid, in the 60s, is to basically cave in rather than fight, to try to buy off rather than confront. And so I think they felt that if Trump got reelected, that there would be a lot of riots, and I think they decided that from their point of view, their damage would be less. I don't know. That's interesting. Whether damage really will be less or not. I mean, obviously their insurance rates, I assume, are going up because of all the rioting and property damage, or else they're going to have to self-insure and just eat it as a loss. But anyhow, I think the other fact is that there's a kind of an establishment bias against Trump just because of what I would call his personality, which is a very person on the street type presentation, and I think that irks these people to no end, and I think that leads them to make decisions that are even against their own interests. I think you see this also to some degree in what you might call the suburban and upper class female population too. And I mean, what I'm saying is they're not really making an objective viewpoint of, which would be really better for them and their interests. They get more into like, well, I just don't like what he says or the way he says it. And I think that had a lot to do with it too. I don't think there was any, they keep going about the anti-democratic tendencies, and not in the sense of Big D, the Democrat Party, but they're talking about the idea of the system, and yet pretty clear cut that the quote, Democrats are the most anti-democratic force in this country. I mean, in a lot of ways. And so forth. But it's an interesting article, and I think it kind of confirms a lot of what Trump was up against. And my own thought was, though, that he had essentially zero chance of pulling it out after the December the 14th certification dates. There was, at that late stage, there was just no way he was going to get any sort of decision, court decision or otherwise, that was going to change it, which was kind of the position I was taking at the time, if you'll go back and look at some of my videos of that period. So anyway, I thought that's an interesting thing to look at. It's been a kind of a topical thing and worth noticing. Another thing to notice is on the Senate votes on the big $2.9 trillion so-called COVID relief bill, probably more like you call it the Democrat Party slush fund bill primarily, or buy votes bill, or what you want to call it. Because there's really no need for expenditure of that level at this point, obviously. I mean, we already have nearly $1 trillion just appropriated, mostly unspent from the end of last year. I think that something much more modest, like the $600 billion that has been proposed by that group of 10 Republicans, would have been more effective. But what you have, though, is that this is a Democrat Party that's in position to seize power by any means necessary. So anyhow, but what was very interesting is they had this whole, they're going to use reconciliation to ram through their bill. And we had this thing where, Senator Joe Manchin made all this presentation that they were going to make sure that the Republicans had their chance to get their amendments in, and that they were going to try to make a compromise. And so what ends up happening is they spend a whole evening and through into the wee hours of the morning doing a whole series of amendments under the reconciliation process. And then the last amendment that comes up, and by the way, there were several amendments that were supported by Joe Manchin, John Tester, and other Democrats. I think Sinema had one in there on things like the Keystone Pipeline, on things like the giving stimulus checks to illegal immigrants, and things. Let's see, the other one was on fracking on government lands. Those are the three things that were passed with Democrat votes and all the Republicans. Okay. And what happens? The last amendment was put up by Schumer, which was basically to remove all the things they just put in. And guess what? Every Democrat voted for it, including Manchin, including Tester, etc. And of course, the tie was broken by Kamala Harris, and then the bill was passed, which I think shows that was completely hypocritical. It was completely deceptive. It reeks of John Kerry's "I voted for it before I voted against it" statement, if you recall. Well, maybe you don't, but from the 2004 campaign, a classic political statement. So yeah, they're obviously phonies, which is why I say don't vote for a Democrat, period. And unless you really like their kind of socialist policies. And if you like what they do, then that's different. But if you don't, I mean, don't think they're going to be at all reasonable. And of course, the latest thing they're doing is this whole idea of forgiving student debt up to maybe $50,000 or where the number is. I think Biden had a lower number. Now the far left is pushing him to go higher. And of course, my viewpoint on that would be that the one problem of student debt is that you can't get out of it by bankruptcy. And so, obviously, it's a case that, I can see why if somebody, accumulates a bunch of student debt and ends up not graduating and not really having a better job than they would have had if they'd just gone to work out of high school and stuck with tens of thousands of dollars of debt, or they get a degree in something that's totally non-marketable. That I think the thing to do is simply change the law so that they can declare bankruptcy like any other debt. I think that would be a fair way to handle it, and at the same way, it would let those people get out, and it wouldn't give $50,000 to people who are working on Wall Street with an MBA from Harvard or something, just getting an extra $50,000 because, well, gee, here's $50,000 for you too. I mean, if we're going to give money away, let's give it to the needy, not give it to the greedy. So, at any rate, that's kind of my thought. But this just kind of goes to show the situation there in the Senate, and I think it doesn't look like any of these Democrats in these states like Montana or West Virginia are really going to do a whole lot to protect the interests of their own workers so far. And maybe I'm prejudging them. We'll see what ultimately comes out of it. I get the feeling that poor old Joe Manchin's under a lot of pressure, and there's a real solution for him if he'd take it. Just switch parties and become a Republican. I think his pressure would be a lot off. I mean, we have all kind of Republicans voting to do all kind of things outside of the party line. So I don't see why he couldn't become another one. At least he could, vote his own conscience a little bit more on some of the issues about his state. So that's kind of the issues that I want to kind of get to today. I think I still think that Time Magazine article is interesting. Now. Mike Lindell's got a 2-hour video out on election fraud, which is I watched most of that the other day. It's a mishmash of various theories. It isn't consistent at all. I mean, it goes from everything to the stuff that Peter Navarro put together, which I think is fairly rational about the possibility of large numbers of illegal votes being counted, to the other extreme that the Chinese had hacked all the voting machines, and he's got these graphics of all these packets of information coming from China to all these different states. And I mean, it's like it's such a throw it all against the wall presentation without a coherent theory of what really happened. And that's the downside of that. I think these, and of course, all these conspiracy theorists have just managed to get Lou Dobbs fired off of Fox Business. And Lou Dobbs is a good guy on a lot of issues, but man, the Fox got hit with a $2.7 billion lawsuit by Smartmatic because of the things that Sidney Powell had stated on the air there, and apparently he sort of supported it a little too much. We'll see if it impacts anybody else and how Fox actually navigates the lawsuit. I'm assuming that they said of all the people, he's the one that was the most supportive of it, and the other people perhaps were much more restrained. I mean, I think they're a little bit after Pirro and Sean Hannity, and I suspect that we'll see how that plays out. I don't know that they went near as far out on a limb as he did, and so I think they're figuring that by cutting their losses there. I think it's sad. I kind of liked them. But I do think that they fell for a lot of stuff. I mean, for instance, the whole Smartmatic claim, think about what they're saying, that they were having electronic voting machines, not mechanical ones like they have in New York or something in the old days, but in Venezuela back around the time of Hugo Chavez seizing power. I mean, we didn't have those in this country until 2004, basically, with the Diebel touchscreens and things like that came out after the big election battles of 2002 in Florida and the hanging Chad. I mean, there's a lot of things, if you just think about it, were really not logical. And that the idea that this was all set up as a big algorithm, and I mean, I think in my videos at the time, I think I was going, well, okay, let's see, because there was always the problem with that how do you explain the fact that the Republicans picked up 15 House seats while we won 18 out of 19 bellwether counties that are used by the political scientists to predict election results, and yet still lost the presidency with this massive vote swapping thing online? That never made a lot of sense. And the real answer is it doesn't. What really is a real issue, though, is what's in like the Peter Navarro studies. And he may very well overstate the case, but he doesn't need. You could cut his results by probably, I don't know, factor of 4. I have to go to the exact numbers. Substantially cut it back. You'd still have the same result, is that fraudulent votes were decisive because the margins in victory in key states were so small. I mean, and due to illegal voting activity. After all, I think that the people suing in Wisconsin came within one vote in the state Supreme Court over the issue. So it wasn't, I think there was at least 3 of the justices on that, or judges, whatever you call them, on the Supreme State Court, voted with the lawsuit against the election laws changes. And certainly the same kind of thing happened in the Pennsylvania case. So certainly I think it's quite plausible that from a, what you might call it, a quote, God's eye view of only legal votes, following the rules and not, all these changes that this group, which I have to mention this too, that the Time magazine even refers to them as a cabal. I thought that was very funny. But yeah, that pulled off, they were able to swap things around, but there were a fair number of illegal votes, and there are in every election. And I think there was just more in 2020 than most because of the motivational level of the left, I think. So that's that. But I mean, I just thought this you might see this video, but it's really a little too much. Absolute proof. I mean, come on. But I think it is. I definitely do think there was fraud was a decisive factor, but it was a small amount of votes and close elections. We just have a settlement in New York on a House race, which was won by, I see varying numbers, but something like 120 votes or something like that. I see 125 or 112, but it's in low triple digits. And I guess, and interesting enough, the Democrat lawyer is now trying to appeal the decision based on irregularities with the voting machines. So we'll see how that pans out there. But it looks like, I'm just saying that what you're seeing is a concentration of votes in certain urbanized areas that were able to flip the vote. And but anyhow, so I just thought to warn you that you can look at that one also with a bit of a grain of salt, so to speak. It's out there on the internet, but it's 2 hours long, and some of the same people that were in a lot of the meetings, I don't know whether they're going to get sued next or not. I mean, it would be interesting, I guess, if you want to get into the actual litigation of it. I mean, the downside, of course, if you get involved in you're liable, if you lose, you're going to get hit pretty hard. I've kind of wondered if, maybe News Corp, looking at the lawsuit, the smart thing might be just to try to buy Smartmatic. I mean, is it really worth $2.7 billion? I mean, I'm saying I don't know if it's that big of a company. I mean, maybe just buying it might be the answer. There'd be a way to settle the lawsuit. I don't know. And anyhow, if that's feasible or not, or whether the government would somehow block that, but it's an interesting idea. But as I said, the cabal. We get back to the original thing. The cabal story actually shows the danger we're in. I've been saying this ever since this started these video segments. I fear the development of an effective, quote, textbook fascist state. Not meaning necessarily brown shirts on the street, smashing windows and store, but yet we've had some people in black running around smashing windows and setting fires. So, there is that aspect of it, but I don't think it's going to turn into a formal, regime like Mussolini or something. But in a sense, it will. But it'll be a soft form of fascism, I think, in the sense of that you're going to have an alliance of business, labor, and big media, big tech, big government, all working together to basically control the population. And I think that's emerging pretty much, and we'll see if we can push back on it. But the idea of controlling what ideas and information people have is a big part of what's in the Times story. And obviously that has not ended with the election. If anything, it's intensified afterwards, because now they feel they have more government support to do it. And if in other words, if Zuckerberg, and Jack Dorsey were so helpful in electing the current president who's ruling by executive orders, you're going to see that they're probably going to reciprocate a little bit, that it's going to be kind of like in Russia, with the relationship between Putin and all the oligarchs, right? Kind of interesting, huh? Yeah. Very similar situation in a way. And after all, remember, Putin was democratically elected, in quotes, around democratically. He didn't take over by a military coup. So, or something of that sort, or even a violent revolution. So, the freedoms are at risk right now, that's for sure. And one last note, I guess they did go ahead and a very unprecedented action strip this Marjorie Greene, a Congress lady from the 14th District of Georgia, from her committee assignments. And she came out and made a fairly good little speech yesterday about it. And I think, I kind of had a somewhat negative impression of her early on, just because of, I don't know, that maybe she wasn't too swift or something. But actually, I was kind of impressed with what she said in the speech. So I think I can see she's a bit of a force to be reckoned with here. And like she says, she don't have to spend her time on a bunch of boring committees, or she would have no influence anyhow, because the Democrats rule everything in the House by a slim majority, but they rule it. I mean, they're even imposing $5,000 fines if you don't go through a metal detector or something. I mean, the actual members. I guess they're afraid that the actual member of Congress is going to slip a weapon into the House chamber and do something. Crazy. That's the kind of thing that is going on right now. They've turned the D.C. area into an armed camp, and you're sitting there going, listen to this thing, and you're going, nobody's going to come back and do anything now. There's no big protest. There's nothing to cover the activity that might occur. That was a group of fringe groups that seized an opportunity because they knew there were going to be big crowds there, and that gave them cover to do what they were planning on doing. But now, seriously, and you need 7,000 National Guard troops that do what would probably only take a few hundred to deal with, if at worst anyhow. A lot of propaganda going on. So, well, I guess we're kind of coming to a close on this thing. I didn't want to get too long, and like I said, the Time article's I'll post it in the link below. And I guess next week we get to be treated to the second impeachment trial of Donald Trump, and we'll see how long that is and where that goes. All for now.